Growing older doesn't mean growing smaller. It means discovering new ways to protect what matters most. Your strength, your confidence, your independence, and the ordinary moments that make life beautiful. Here at Senior Health Essence. Margaret had walked down these 3 wooden porch steps every single morning for almost 20 years. She never counted them. She never had to. They were simply part of home, part of life. Every morning began the same way. A warm mug of coffee, a deep breath of cool Ohio air. She smiled, took another sip of coffee, and stepped toward the stairs. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. The sky, the flowers, the porch, the morning light. Nothing seemed different. Nothing seemed wrong. Not yet. The first step felt normal. So did the second. Margaret barely noticed them. She had walked these steps thousands of times before. But when she reached the third, her left leg hesitated. Only for a moment. Less than 2 seconds. No sharp pain. No dizziness. No frightening sensation. Just a strange feeling that her leg wasn't quite ready to follow. She stopped. Not because she had fallen. Because something felt. Margaret laughed softly. Almost to herself. Well, I suppose that's what 74 feels like. The words came easily. Too easily. Because she had heard them before. From neighbors. From friends at church. From people standing in line at the grocery store. We all slow down eventually. That's life. That's aging. Margaret believed those words. Not because a doctor had told her. Because everyone else seemed to believe them too. She brushed the thought away. Finished her coffee. And continued with her morning. But every now and then, throughout the rest of the day, she found herself thinking about those 2 quiet seconds on the porch. Only 2 seconds. Yet somehow, they refused to leave her mind. That afternoon, Emily stopped by after work. She carried a paper grocery bag in one arm, and a fresh blueberry pie in the other. Sunday dinner wasn't until tomorrow, but she always liked surprising her grandmother. Margaret smiled the moment she opened the door. "You're spoiling me again." Emily laughed. "I learned from the best." They talked. Made tea. Folded laundry together. Just another ordinary afternoon. Until Margaret stood up from the kitchen chair. Emily didn't say anything. She simply watched. Her grandmother paused. Just for a heartbeat. Before taking her first step. Most people would never have noticed. Emily did. Because she knew Margaret. And something about that tiny pause didn't belong. Emily saw something Margaret couldn't. Welcome to Senior Health Essence. Where every story begins with life, is guided by science, and ends with hope. If you had met Margaret that week, you probably would have thought exactly what everyone else did. She looked healthy. She smiled often. She still drove herself to church every Sunday. She never missed her Tuesday morning volunteer shift at the local library. And every Friday afternoon, she baked an apple pie. Not because someone asked her to, because that was simply who she was. Independent. Reliable. The kind of neighbor who remembered birthdays. The kind of grandmother who never forgot to mail handwritten Christmas cards. Margaret took quiet pride in taking care of herself. She didn't like asking for help. In fact, she avoided it whenever she could. If a jar wouldn't open, she would try 3 more times before calling Emily. If groceries felt a little heavier than usual, she simply made 2 trips from the car. She had spent an entire lifetime solving her own problems. Growing older wasn't going to change that. At least, that's what she wanted to believe. Because somewhere deep inside, there was one thought she never spoke out loud. What if this is the beginning of losing my independence? It wasn't the weakness that frightened her. It was what the weakness might someday mean. That evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table, answering emails she had already read twice. Her laptop was open, but her thoughts kept drifting somewhere else. Back to her grandmother. Back to that tiny pause before the first step. Most people would never have noticed it. Emily almost hadn't. But once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. She remembered something her mother had once said. Older people rarely tell you when something is wrong. They slowly change what they do instead. Those words suddenly carried a different meaning. Emily opened her phone, scrolled through old family photos. There was Grandma Margaret, laughing while carrying 2 bags of potting soil. Another photo, walking 5 miles during a charity event. Another, lifting her youngest grandson onto her shoulders. Emily smiled. Then she looked at the date. Only 4 years ago. 4 years. That wasn't very long. What had changed? Was it simply age? Or was something else quietly happening? Long before anyone noticed? Emily decided she wouldn't ignore it. Not this time. The next morning, Emily returned with breakfast. Fresh fruit, whole grain toast, and Margaret's favorite coffee. They sat together on the porch, just as they had done dozens of times before. For a while, they talked about the weather, the neighbors, the flowers that needed watering. Nothing unusual. Then Emily looked at her grandmother and asked quietly, "Grandma, when was the last time your legs actually felt strong?" Margaret didn't answer. Not right away. She stared across the garden, as if the answer might be hidden somewhere among the roses. Finally, she smiled. But it wasn't the same smile as yesterday. "I honestly don't remember." Those 5 words were heavier than either of them expected, because for the first time, Margaret realized she couldn't remember when feeling weak had become normal. And perhaps that was the most important clue of all. Millions of older Americans wake up every morning believing the same thing. My legs are weaker. But that's just what happens after 70. That belief is true. Our bodies do change with age. Muscles naturally become smaller. Balance becomes more delicate. Recovery takes a little longer. Growing older is real. But here's something equally true. Not every change is caused by aging alone. Our body is trying to tell us something much earlier. Something we can actually improve. Something we can strengthen. Something we can understand. The challenge is this. Those messages rarely arrive with loud alarms. They arrive quietly. One slower step. One missed walk. One hand reaching for a railing. One afternoon, when getting out of a chair suddenly feels harder than it used to. Small moments. Easy to dismiss. Easy to explain away. Until one day, they begin to shape the life we're living. Margaret didn't know it yet. But within the next few days, she would learn something that changed the way she thought about her legs, and about growing older itself. And perhaps, it might change the way you think, too. The next few mornings, Margaret paid a little more attention. Not because she wanted to, because now, she couldn't help it. She noticed how long it took to stand after breakfast. She noticed herself pausing before climbing the porch steps. She noticed that carrying the laundry basket upstairs suddenly felt heavier. Nothing hurt. Nothing looked wrong. If someone had asked her, "How are you feeling?" she would have smiled and answered, "I'm doing just fine." And in many ways, that was true. She was still cooking, still driving, still meeting friends for Sunday service, still laughing whenever Emily called. Life hadn't stopped. It had simply become a little smaller. Without realizing it, Margaret had started adjusting her world to match what her legs could still do. Instead of asking why her legs felt weaker, she quietly began asking less of them. It happened so gradually. She never noticed the trade she was making. A little less walking. A few more moments sitting. One less trip to the garden. One less evening stroll. Small choices. Almost invisible. Yet each one quietly whispered the same message. Something had changed. Sometimes we don't notice what we've lost, because we've slowly learned to live without it, remained silent. But somewhere deep inside, that fear had been waiting for a long time. The following Monday, Emily called. "Grandma, would you do something for me?" Margaret laughed. "That depends." Emily smiled. "I'd like you to schedule a regular checkup." Margaret walked into her doctor's office, expecting reassurance, expecting to hear exactly what she already believed, that the was simply another part of getting older. She had no idea. The first question her doctor asked would completely change the direction of their conversation. Margaret had expected the appointment to be simple. A quick examination. Perhaps a reminder to exercise more. Maybe a comment about getting older. Instead, her doctor sat down, closed the medical chart, looked directly at her, and asked, "Margaret, when was the last time you felt truly strong?" The question caught her off guard. She had prepared herself to describe symptoms. She hadn't prepared herself to remember how she used to feel. She searched her memory. 5 years ago? Maybe. 7. She wasn't sure anymore. The doctor nodded gently. Then he said something she would remember for a very long time. "Most people tell me when the weakness started. I like asking when they last felt strong." Those are two very different questions. Margaret smiled. She had never thought about it that way. Neither had Emily. The doctor leaned back in his chair. "I hear the same sentence almost every day. Doctor, I'm getting older." He smiled kindly. "And that's absolutely true. We all are." But here's where people often stop asking questions. He reached for a sheet of paper and drew 2 simple lines. One line sloped gently downward. The other dropped much more quickly. "Aging," he explained, "is usually gradual. But when strength begins disappearing faster than expected, your body deserves a closer look." Margaret studied the drawing. It looked so simple, yet somehow changed everything. She had spent months assuming age was the answer. She had never stopped to ask whether age was the whole story. The doctor folded his hands. "Margaret, have you noticed yourself walking less?" She nodded. "What about carrying fewer groceries?" Another nod. "Using the handrail more often?" This time, Margaret laughed. "I thought you had been watching me." The doctor smiled. "I haven't. I've simply met thousands of people your age." He paused. "And they often tell me the same story. Not because older adults become careless. Not because they become weak overnight. Because they slowly begin adapting. Doing a little less. Avoiding a little more. Resting a little earlier. Until one day, their muscles have quietly adapted too." Emily looked toward her grandmother. She suddenly realized those tiny daily changes weren't protecting Margaret. They were slowly teaching her body to do less. Sometimes, protecting ourselves slowly makes us weaker. The doctor wasn't trying to frighten her. Quite the opposite. He smiled. "Margaret, I actually have good news." She looked surprised. "The human body is remarkably adaptable. It becomes weaker when we ask less of it. But it can also become stronger when we begin asking a little more." Emily leaned forward. "So this isn't permanent?" The doctor shook his head. "Not necessarily. Age changes our bodies. But age doesn't erase their ability to respond." Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced for weeks. Relief. Not because every answer had been found, but because, for the first time, someone had offered possibility instead of limitation. Dr. Carter smiled. Then he reached toward the model of a human leg sitting on the shelf beside his desk. "Margaret, may I show you something remarkable?" She nodded. The doctor gently rested one hand on the model. When most people think about walking, they think about their legs. But walking doesn't actually begin here. He tapped the model lightly. "It begins in the brain." Margaret looked surprised. "The brain?" Dr. Carter smiled. "Every single step you take is a conversation. Your brain sends a message. Your nerves carry it. Your muscles answer. And your balance quietly keeps everything working together." He paused. "So when your legs begin feeling weaker, the muscles are only one part of the story." Margaret looked down at her own hands. She had never imagined something as ordinary as taking a step could involve so many different parts of the body. Dr. Carter smiled again. "The wonderful thing is that many of those systems can still improve, even after 70. For the first time that morning, Margaret felt curiosity. Instead of fear, Dr. Carter picked up a pencil. Let's imagine something together. He drew two simple circles. The first circle represents the muscles you had at 40. Then he drew another, slightly smaller. This one is where many people are after 70. Margaret studied the paper. It doesn't look like much. The doctor nodded. Exactly. Muscle loss is rarely dramatic. It happens quietly. A little each year. So quietly. Most people never notice. Emily leaned forward. So why does it suddenly feel different? Dr. Carter smiled. Because your body is wonderfully adaptable. It keeps compensating. For years. Until one day, there isn't enough strength left to hide the changes. Margaret thought about the porch steps. Maybe those 2 seconds hadn't appeared overnight after all. Maybe they had been years in the making. Dr. Carter folded the paper, then smiled. I've told you what happens. Now I'd like to tell you something much more important. Margaret waited. The body isn't trying to work against you. It's trying to adapt. If you spend more time sitting, your muscles adapt. If you stop challenging your balance adapts. If climbing stairs becomes rare, your legs adapt. Emily frowned. So we're teaching our body without realizing it? Exactly. Dr. Carter nodded. And here's the beautiful part. We can begin teaching it something different. Margaret looked at him. You mean, I can become stronger? The doctor smiled. I believe you can become stronger than you are today. And that's the only comparison that truly matters. Margaret laughed softly. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't seem smaller. It seemed possible. Dr. Carter pulled a simple chair into the middle of the room. No machines. No expensive equipment. Just one chair. Margaret looked puzzled. This little test can tell us much more than people expect. He asked her to sit comfortably, feet flat on the floor, arms folded gently across her chest. When you're ready, stand up. Margaret stood, slowly, then sat back down. Again. She repeated the movement. By the 5th time, she noticed herself breathing a little harder. By the 8th, her thighs began to tremble slightly. The doctor wasn't judging her. He was observing. After she finished, he smiled warmly. Margaret, I think we've found where your journey begins. Not with medication, not with fear, but with rebuilding confidence. One movement at a time. Margaret looked toward Emily. Emily smiled. Without saying a word. They both knew. This conversation had already changed something. The next morning, Margaret woke a little earlier than usual. Not because she had somewhere to be. Because she had something to try. The doctor's words stayed with her. Your body is always adapting. She poured herself a cup of coffee, then walked toward the kitchen window. The roses were gently moving in the morning breeze. For a moment, everything looked exactly the same. But Margaret wasn't the same woman who had walked into the clinic 2 days earlier. She wasn't searching for a miracle. She wasn't expecting to feel 20 years younger. She simply wondered, what if I could feel a little stronger than yesterday? It wasn't a big goal. It was just enough to begin. Sometimes, getting stronger begins with asking a different question. Before leaving the clinic, Dr. Carter had given Margaret only one assignment. Not a prescription. Not a complicated exercise plan. Just one simple challenge. Every day, stand up from your favorite chair. 10 times. Margaret almost laughed when she heard it. It sounded too easy. Now, standing in her living room, she realized it wasn't. She folded her arms, took a slow breath, and stood. Then she sat down again. 1, 2, 3. By the 6th repetition, her thighs began to feel warm. By the 8th, she noticed herself breathing a little harder. She smiled. Not because it had been easy, because she had finished. Sometimes, progress doesn't begin with doing something extraordinary. Sometimes, it begins by rediscovering something ordinary. Margaret had just trained one of the most important movements for healthy aging, without ever stepping into a gym. As Margaret rested, something remarkable was already happening inside her body. Millions of muscle fibers had been called back to work. Tiny nerve pathways, some of which had been growing quieter over the years, were waking up again. Her brain, her nerve, her muscles were practicing a conversation they hadn't spoken very often lately. This is one of the extraordinary things about the human body. Even in our 70s, and often well beyond, our muscles still respond when we give them a reason. Not overnight, not dramatically, but faithfully. Scientists have discovered that older muscles remain surprisingly adaptable when they are challenged safely and consistently. In other words, our bodies never stop listening. We simply have to keep speaking to them, one movement at a time. 3 days later, Emily stopped by after work. As she opened the front door, she found her grandmother laughing. Alone, standing beside the old armchair. "What are you doing?" Margaret grinned. "I'm winning." Emily laughed. "Winning what?" "My little battle with this chair." Emily watched as Margaret stood up once more. Slowly, carefully, confidently. It wasn't faster. It wasn't perfect. But something had changed. The hesitation was beginning to disappear. Not because Margaret had become stronger overnight, because she had begun believing her body was still worth investing in. And sometimes, hope is the very first muscle that grows stronger. A week passed quietly. Margaret didn't count the days. She counted something else. The mornings that felt a little easier. One Tuesday, Emily arrived just as breakfast was ready. She looked at the table and smiled. "Something's different." Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee. "I've been trying something Dr. Carter suggested." Instead of toast with jam, there were scrambled eggs, a bowl of Greek yogurt, fresh blueberries, and a handful of walnuts. Emily looked surprised. "I thought you never changed your breakfast." Margaret laughed. "I thought so too." She picked up her fork. "Dr. Carter told me my muscles can't rebuild themselves unless I give them something to build with." Emily nodded slowly. Sounded so simple. Yet somehow, she had never thought about food that way. Not as fuel for energy, but as building blocks for strength. Margaret wasn't following a diet. She was giving her body the materials it had quietly been asking for. Strength doesn't begin in the gym. Sometimes it begins at breakfast. Every evening, Margaret used to walk to the corner mailbox. Over the past year, those walks had become shorter. Then, they quietly disappeared. Not because anyone told her to stop, because stopping had become easier. Growing older doesn't mean growing smaller. It means discovering new ways to protect what matters most. Your strength, your confidence, your independence, and the ordinary moments that make life beautiful. Here at Senior Health Essence, we believe every step has a story. Every story deserves hope, and every season of life still has something meaningful to offer. Thank you for spending these moments with us. If Margaret's story reminded you of someone you love, perhaps share it with them. Sometimes, the right story arrives at exactly the right time. And if you'd like to continue this journey with us, we'd be honored to welcome you back. Because here, we don't simply talk about growing older. We explore how to live each season with strength, with wisdom, and with hope. Welcome to Senior Health Essence, where every story begins with life, is guided by science, and ends with hope. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself. We'll be here when you're ready for the next story.